So regardless you are working for a company that has a shred of human decency to not boot you out in the midst of an economic crisis where the government officials have little to no political will to support its constituents if it does not benefit them in the next election cycle, the decisions would always be one-sided. Whatever it is that your boss has to say, you would have no choice but to comply. The idea here is that you would have a representative democracy, where the workers get to elect the managers who would make the decisions for them. Now, I'm sure there must be some greater specifics on the kind of decisions that are delegated to these managers and those that are still retained by the workers. I generally think that one of the reasons why co-op hasn't picked up traction in Indonesia is because, as a concept, co-ops is not mainstream enough, it's not normalized enough. This is despite the fact that the principle of co-ops is very much aligned with Indonesian values. We have this phrase called gotong royong, which roughly translates to working together or helping each other. Now tell me how that's not analogous to co-ops. Hello there. Welcome to the Pit of Tangents. Today, I would like to introduce you to the world of worker co-ops. I've slightly touched on this in my last Getting Exposed to Left Discourse video. This is one of the main things that captured my attention when I was watching the left-leaning content creators. That alongside of transgenderism. More on that in the future. Just for a quick refresher, my current understanding is that worker co-ops is a workplace, an enterprise, a company, or however you want to call it, where the ownership of said establishment is in the hands of the workers. Yes, the extent to which they hold control varies, but that's the general idea. The implementation of such ownership is done through democracy. This means that the workers actually takes part in the decision-making process in, say, for instance, future targets, company strategies, the prices of their products, and of course, and this is the most important part, how much they're getting paid. This is definitely going to be a topic that I will revisit multiple times, as it is both complex and continuously evolving. For this video, I will start with my baseline understanding, so picking up from how I was introduced to the concept, so don't be surprised if I'll be repeating some of my previous points, going through my initial thoughts about it, including my contentions, because worker co-ops is by no means perfect, at least from my current perspective, and to end it, some concluding remarks and follow-up questions that I intend to delve into in future segments. In answering these questions, you will see me analyzing some academic research, probably with some statistics, some initiatives, and of course I will go through the developments of worker co-ops in Indonesia. Hopefully from each segment, you will see how I gradually improve my understanding of worker co-ops, be it positively or negatively, with the ultimate goal of assessing whether or not co-ops is feasible to be in the forefront of how companies should be organized in the future. Okay, with that out of the way, let's start with my baseline understanding. So, worker co-ops, democratizing the workplace, encouraging worker participation through democratic means. So what? To explain that, we'll need to contrast it with conventional corporate hierarchy and what usually happens there. Normally, we would either have the business owner or the upper management, who would then bear the sole responsibility of making the business decisions, which is then delegated to middle management and then to the rest of the company. If it is a publicly listed firm, then it would also require the approval of the major shareholders, or at the very least, the board of directors who make the decisions would have to be appointed by the shareholders. Let me use the company that I work for right now as an example. Usually, the decisions from the higher ups would be shared during the firm's annual outing. Aside from the recreational activities that we would do, often involving an unhealthy amount of alcohol, we would also have a formal convention where the director would announce this year's achievement, along with next year's targets, markets to explore, employee satisfaction survey, target turnovers, and so on. I'm gonna be frank with you. The moment that those numbers pop up on the monitor, My reaction was, alright, I don't give a fuck about this. Back to partying! Call me out for being a poor employee, but in all seriousness though, why would I care? It's not like I took part in it, or it's not like they elaborated how they came up with the numbers in the first place. Sure, we can reasonably expect that they considered past performances and market outlooks. They also could have considered aspirations from middle management to be more comprehensive. I imagine this is what happens in my company whenever they have their regular management meetings. Whatever the case may be, that announcement just resulted with an overwhelming sense of indifference. Sure, I would probably care more about it given that the numbers were jarring. Let's say like unreasonable targets, or let's say that suddenly everyone across the firm was denied of their bonuses. Although, given that was the case, they would have probably given more justification. Full disclosure, by the way, I'm not saying this to throw shade on the company that I'm working for. They're not necessarily to be blamed because this is just how things are for most workplaces. And honestly, listening to the kind of shit that people have to put up with in their jobs, I'm in no position to complain. I am definitely one of the privileged ones when it comes to employee well-being. Mind you, I'm a consultant, so this is really saying something. Let's say during the start of the pandemic, we were one of the first companies to implement work from home. There were no salary cuts, no massive downsizing, at least not to my knowledge. The only compromise that we had to endure, if you even call it endure, is delayed bonuses and job promotions. So in that sense, I'm truly grateful, but obviously this is more of an outlier rather than a general practice. How many of you suffered from deferred paychecks, salary cuts, or even get fired? Yes, the economy is tumbling, revenues are dropping. But when they gave you that devastating news, how many of your bosses actually provided you with an explanation? How many of them exhausted all possible recourse to keep you employed? How many of them even try to take some money out of their own paychecks to make sure that you stay for as long as possible? How many of them actually hosted a meeting where then they would lay out the situation, and instead of saying, because of that, you'll be only getting 50% of your salary, they asked, okay, here are some options that we could do along with the potential outcomes. Let's put it up for a vote. Now, I don't know about you, but those are two completely different scenarios. They could lead to the same outcome, sure. The employees could collectively decide to have all of their salaries cut by 50%, but the first one is inexplicably more exclusionary. Emphasis on that word, exclusionary. This is the crux of my argument. That feeling of indifference that I mentioned earlier can largely be attributed to the exclusionary decision-making process. Our aspirations might have been a contributing factor, but by the end of the day, we still don't have the final say. So regardless you are working for a company that has a shred of human decency to not boot you out in the midst of an economic crisis where the government officials have little to no political will to support its constituents if it does not benefit them in the next election cycle, the decisions would always be one-sided. Whatever it is that your boss has to say, you would have no choice but to comply. If you think it's an economic crisis, you should be grateful to even have a job. Well, these decisions can very well happen during times of growth, be it an unreasonable target that was set because shareholders demand higher returns, or say there was a mergers and acquisition where it is usually accompanied by a lot of people getting thrown out to the streets. If that happens, then what? You don't really have a say in it, do you? There's really no way for you to push back against these decisions. Sure, you can stage a protest, but you can only do that after the fact. Deals have been made. The die has been cast. Let me be clear, however, implementing the worker co-op way does not guarantee that you won't experience any downturns, which could lead to layoffs and businesses shutting down. The emphasis here is the extent of labor participation, and with that, labor protection. In the counterfactual scenario, the workers can still collectively decide to cut down their wages by 50%. Emphasis on the word collectively. When the decision is made one-sided, whether it is the business owners or the board of directors, they would be more inclined to protect their own interests. The workers, on the other hand, becomes expendable. To avoid sounding awfully one-sided, like, all you think about is the laborers, what about the business as a whole? Well, I would argue that in a conventional top-down hierarchy, there's bound to be some wasted potential that could have been used to improve the quality of a company. Allow me to elaborate on that. Let's get back to the exclusionary decision-making process. What would be the result of that? I think that there's going to be a higher likelihood where the employees would not have a sense of belonging. With that, there's less loyalty. With less loyalty comes wasted potential. Why is that? Because they would be less inclined to provide their ideas and insights that could improve the overall company. Their voices, at least in the grand scheme of things, simply don't matter as much, so they are disincentivized to speak up. Unless we continue to chip away labor's bargaining power as the market continues to become more and more saturated to a point where you will not have any options but to voice out your ideas in order to even stand a chance to climb up the corporate ladder. Wait, we're already doing that. God damn it. Alright, let's talk about job satisfaction. I hope you know that this spans beyond how much you're getting paid. Usually, when people talk about job satisfaction, we're talking about facilities, amenities, the insurance coverage that they provide, the number of annual paid leave that you get, work environment, the employee relations, and so on. Let's put those aside for now. What I want to talk about is job satisfaction distilled to its most fundamental form. Are you happy with your job? Look, many people, including those who share my profession, only come to work for the sake of collecting their paycheck. They only work for the sake of getting by, and even for those who do get by, they would find themselves questioning their purpose for being in the company. Now, I don't know about you, but that seems pretty depressing to me. There's an entire discourse to unpack here regarding how we are all essentially coerced into working under the threat of starvation. Another thing is that the so-called market doesn't exactly lead to the most ethical results when it comes to valuing people's work. We'll cover that in future segments. When people are confronted with these type of situation, they are incentivized to compromise the things they are technically more passionate about, or sometimes even things that are more aligned with your skills and educational background for something else. All done for the sake of better pay. These outcomes are pretty understandable, of course. I mean, what good is following your passion if you can't keep a roof over your head? If anything, it would only hamper your ability to do it. I guess this is probably why a lot of people would maintain their unfulfilling jobs to basically finance their actual interests. Preventing yourself from starvation, keeping a roof over your head, finding meaning from your work. I guess it's only natural if we touch on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Just to make sure we are on the same page, Maslow's hierarchy of needs consists of several levels, starting with physiological needs, so food, clothing, shelter, then safety, which includes employment and health, then love and friendships, followed by esteem, like respect, status, recognition, and on top, self-actualization. I'm sure you're familiar with this. The idea behind this is that people would prioritize the needs at the bottom before moving on or even thinking about those above. Why is this relevant? Well, the fact of the matter is, being employed doesn't necessarily mean you get to meet your basic needs, at least not at an adequate level. If you generally believe that making minimum wages in Indonesia means that you can afford a decent living space with the capacity to get proper nutrition and able to raise a family, you're frankly delusional. When you're in a condition where you are constantly at risk of not being able to pay your bills, what that does to you is that you're subconsciously barred from thinking about your other needs. Everything becomes about money. You won't even have the capacity to think about other things. Even if you do find yourself with a job that could adequately fulfill the first two levels, how many of you had to do that at the cost of your need to socialize? How many of you are subjected to working conditions that require you to squeeze every ounce of energy that you have to a point that during the weekends, you just don't want to do anything. You just want to sleep the whole day. How many of you feel the difficulties of building new social circles outside of your colleagues, finding love, creating meaningful connections? We haven't even talked about prestige and self-actualization. All that considered, can co-ops solve all of these issues? TLDW, no, not necessarily. Let's start with better pay. On paper, yes, a worker co-op would allow at least better pay. During the inception of the company, you can collectively decide the value of the labor for each employee per job prescription or position, which can be adjusted annually or however frequent that you prefer. Would this affect the company's financial structure? Well, you would probably get to democratically decide the amount of profit that the company gets to retain for future expansions, investments, etc., where the rest can be allocated for probably higher wages or bonuses. If you think that this sounds like dividends for shareholders, then you are correct. Like I mentioned at the beginning, a worker co-op is basically workers owning the workplace. So, much like a conventional corporation, as an owner, you are entitled to a sum of the company's profit. What this means is that, at the very least, even if you do find yourself in a job that does not resonate with you, you would be more likely to be better compensated. What happens to the shareholders, you might ask? Good question. I guess this is most relevant for companies that are converting from conventional structure to co-op structure. This is definitely something that I intend to look into because I was informed that co-ops actually have various structures, including how it would look like during transitionary stages, or even those who would seek equity financing by making them publicly listed. My prediction is that the company would probably have the employees holding the majority of the shares, possibly as one entity, like a special purpose vehicle kind of way. This means that the workers would still retain the most power in the decision-making process, which is pretty much how businesses are today, where the business owner would hold the majority. The more extreme version of this is probably to have all the other shareholders as silent investors, where they're only there for the dividends. I'm just spitballing here, but this is definitely something that I want to dig into because one of the integral aspects of ensuring that worker co-ops is universally accepted is to identify means in which it could seamlessly integrate with the current economic system, which entails the investors in the stock market. Alright, so better compensation. Next up is better working conditions. Since a worker co-op would allow its employees to have a higher bargaining power, of course, malicious practices such as child labor or unsafe work environments can be mitigated. Apart from that, there's certainly room to decide your workload. Companies would always push for a better efficiency for the sake of improving their profitability. Their intention may be good, but what I don't like is that it would often come at the cost of the employee's well-being. This would not happen in a worker co-op because the people who make these decisions have actual skin in the game. Even if they do collectively decide to do that, as unlikely as that might be, at least they would directly benefit from it. Speaking of skin in the game, side note here, an added benefit to having a co-op structure is how it encourages individual responsibility, since now your decisions will have a material effect on the continuation of the firm. The whole "I don't give a fuck about this, back to partying," that would not fly in a co-op, because I will have to take an active participation in coming up with those future targets. Through said active participation, just to get back to the original point here, the workers are more likely to be invested in the company because they would have more sense of belonging. This feeds back into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where suddenly we resolve all of the issues. Through better pay, you are more likely to be able to meet your basic needs, so we covered the two at the bottom of the pyramid. Through better working conditions, no doubt this would help cover our need to socialize and build meaningful connections. Remember when I said about wasted potentials? Voila! You can now attain self-actualization because you're more driven to become the best worker that you can be. Alright, I understand that these are all a broad simplification, but I'm sure you would agree that co-op is a step towards the right direction. Nevertheless, I still have So, despite of all the potential benefits, why do I think that co-ops is not the silver bullet to all world's problems? First, I'm willing to admit that this could, in some respects, come at the cost of efficiency, because all the workers in the company are expected to have a good understanding of the decisions being made, and also agree with it. But hey, we've made these concessions on how our governments are run. Why can't we do this for companies? Now, of course, there's the possibility that the efficiency gains from having more invested employees could outweigh this concern of mine. We'll have to save this for future segments as I delve into past research. The second reservation that I have is whether or not this is scalable. At least when we're talking about co-ops in its truest sense, where each employee gets to vote on each and every decision the company makes. I can see this working for a smaller company, but as it gets larger, you're bound to hit a wall where it simply stops being something that is sustainable. I know, technically we can circumnavigate this by doing what Mondragon did. Mondragon is one of the most notable worker co-ops. It's in Spain, it's been around since the 50s, it has around 100,000 employees. The way that they went about things is by making it a federation. In short, Mondragon consists of several separate co-ops that kind of runs on their own, where each of these co-ops would democratically make their own business decisions. They would still have a major meeting where everyone would attend, but there's a certain degree of independence that each of these co-ops would have. Now, full disclosure, I know that Mondragon today is not exactly the shining beacon of how worker co-ops should be. This is an issue for another day. However, I still think that there is some merit into looking at how they balance democracy in the workplace, despite being a pretty large company. The idea here is that you would have a representative democracy, where the workers get to elect the managers who would make the decisions for them. Now, I'm sure there must be some greater specifics on the kind of decisions that are delegated to these managers and those that are still retained by the workers. But I think that this is one way of ensuring that the decision-making process is not clogged up. Now, when I say clogged up here, I'm not implying that every single decision of every day would require the approval of all employees. Like most companies, I'm sure that co-ops have their own laws and procedure that govern their day-to-day operations. Thirdly, just to get back on the issue of indifference, if you're gonna be honest with yourselves, a co-op would still have some level of indifference. Some of you might think, dude, some people just don't care. And yeah, that's a pretty fair assessment on how people are. However, the consequences of this is probably negligible. It's probably going to be similar to how we cope with our job descriptions that are not so enjoyable. So in this case, they would still have to partake in the voting process, but they're probably not going to be the ones who are actively contributing ideas or driving the votes. The possible outcome of this is we would probably have voting blocks, where each of them would have to compete. I know, more office politics, really? I guess this is where a thorough examination on real-world examples is required. Another thing is that, how can we make sure that these democratic processes does not come at the cost of minorities getting discriminated? Now, obviously, this would not be an issue if it is a newly made co-op. Like, why would a xenophobic group of people welcome someone from other groups that they have strong feelings for? So I guess it would be a xenophobic co-op from the start. It wouldn't be as much of a clear cut if we're talking about companies that change their structure, where, out of sheer misfortune, the majority of its laborers happen to be xenophobic or racist. Would that only reify the kind of discrimination that these marginalized groups have been experiencing prior to the transition? Technically, it shouldn't be any different to how we have protected classes in our society, although I'm not sure how that would translate into a company setting. I mean, we already have audits from labor agencies to check whether the working conditions of a company complies to national standards and regulations. I imagine we simply have to incorporate the matter of discrimination into the audit. It shouldn't be too far-fetched considering that GESI, gender equality and social inclusion, has been picking up traction over the past few years. We can also have internal safeguards where decisions that change the constitution, for instance, not hiring from certain groups of people, would require a unanimous vote. The last thing is probably not a concern, but more of a general thought on how co-ops as a concept can be mainstream. I'm honestly skeptical that we can enforce this structure on all companies anytime soon. That would probably be too much of a transformation for the current system to handle. A roadmap is probably more feasible, with total transformation of all businesses into a co-op structure at the end of it. Perhaps with decommodification of essential goods and services as well. Just throwing it out there. So what should we do first? Let's go the German way. Mitbestimmung, or co-determination. I learned about this in one of Richard Wolff's videos, where for large companies, it is obligated that they have 30% of their board of directors to be elected by the workers. This is done to ensure that there's more balance between the interests of the shareholders and the workers. Now, personally, I would go for a 50-50, so it would be completely even. How exactly Germany split the roles of BOD between the ones that are elected by the major shareholders and the ones by the workers is something that I need to look into. I'm assuming operations would be voted by the workers, or would there be two CEOs? One by the workers and one by the shareholders? I don't know. Again, part of a long list of things that I will go through in future segments. I think this 50-50 approach is a critical first step in normalizing co-ops, because through that we begin to change the paradigm where workers get to have a say in how businesses are run. We don't go for a straight 100% co-ops, acknowledging the interests of existing shareholders and investors in general. I understand how this is often used as an excuse to justify the conventional top-down hierarchy, where the business owners and investors are justified to make business decisions without the involvement of the workers because they've taken the risk of putting their money in building the business. Well, whether we like it or not, they did take risk. The thing that is lacking with how things are today is, well, workers also take risk when they choose their jobs. Workers take risks every day when they do their jobs. Now, sadly, this role is not acknowledged, which can be improved through board representation as we chip away the autocratic structure of the business. Even when we have 100% representation, where the authority in making the decisions are even more evenly distributed, I think there's still room where co-ops can leverage the stock market. Remember the whole silent investor thing? It would be a shame if co-ops don't utilize the financing opportunities that could come of it. While we have the 50-50 representation at the board level, we can also try to adopt what UK tried to incorporate not so long ago, the Labour Inclusive Ownership Fund. I'm not sure about the particulars, but the general gist that I got from it was that the government would set up a fund where it would essentially buy out a portion of stocks of companies. Either that or the companies would set out a portion of its stocks for the fund. I'm not sure. Where then the dividends would be allocated for the workers of that company. Note that in the case of what UK tried to do, the government would also get a portion of the dividends, which would then be used to fund their spending. Now, this could be a good model to incorporate, but ideally, the ownership of the stocks should not be under the name of the state, but the laborers themselves, set up under an SPV of some sorts, like I mentioned before. Another key difference is that the emphasis should not be on the dividends. The goal is so that the authority of the workers in the decision-making process would have a stronger legal basis. At the same time, we should reinforce our educational system so that it includes things that the young generation need to look out for when they enter the workplace, whether it is basic accounting, finance, management, and any other business-related skills that is required to keep a company running. I think this is something that people across the political spectrum can get behind, because it would indirectly produce more entrepreneurs. The only difference is they would also be aware of the worker co-op model. Hopefully, this would translate to more co-ops being made. I generally think that one of the reasons why co-op hasn't picked up traction in Indonesia is because, as a concept, co-ops is not mainstream enough, it's not normalized enough. This is despite the fact that the principle of co-ops is very much aligned with Indonesian values. We have this phrase called gotong royong, which roughly translates to working together or helping each other. Now tell me how that's not analogous to co-ops. Another thing is that while we push for co-ops to be mainstreamed, we should not forget to strengthen our unions as well. They have stronger legal precedents, so it should be easier to improve in favor of workers. The clear benefit that would come from this is that it would help to galvanize the working class so that they would realize that they too have power over the market. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of mechanisms that have to be in place in order for you to normalize co-ops. If there's anything that I've learned about politics, is that you should not hinge your entire goal in one policy. You need to be able to utilize every single weapon that you have at your arsenal. This becomes even more crucial when you consider the fact that you're basically trying to change the status quo, where if you experience the tiniest hiccups, they would exploit the living shit out of it. Disclaimer, this roadmap, which is very bare bones by the way, still ties to my baseline understanding. I have no idea about how board representation translates to the well-being of the workers, and God knows I haven't got a clue about the complex dynamics of labor unions. So this is more like a framework which we could use as we move forward. You might be wondering, why do I care so much about worker co-ops? I imagine it's fairly obvious that I have a lot to say about how companies are run, the top-down structure which inevitably creates a rift between employers and employees, which in the absence of strong unions or regulatory framework, disproportionately benefits the bosses. It just saddens me how workers always get the sharp end of the stick. How it is almost always done in the service of bolstering the wealth of either the business owners or the shareholders. The fact that a lot of people don't get paid enough to have a decent life, or even when they do, they would become soulless zombies in the process, or become the ruthless people who perpetuate the same exploitation. The sheer fact that CEOs and business owners get paid an exorbitant amount on the struggles of people who can barely make ends meet is something that I simply cannot get behind. Like, how do we even justify that? Is it simply greed that drives this type of behavior? One that is justified through the dissemination of rugged individualism, where you have no one to blame for your misery than yourself. Whatever the reason is, it's dystopian. And I don't want to live in a society like that. Something to note here is that while I cite co-ops as something integral in improving the well-being of workers, co-ops is really only a transition point before we abolish the commodity form. The idea is that a co-op economy would help catapult our society into one that is no longer driven by profit motive. This is the common criticism that I often hear about co-ops, specifically from a left's perspective. Another one being is that co-ops is still beholden to the market, although I'm not entirely sure what they meant whenever they say they want to abolish the market. My assumption right now is that when they say market, it's market in a capitalistic sense, where the profit motive is a built-in feature indistinguishable from the market itself. Don't quote me on that though. In diving deeper into the subject, I will definitely leverage a video that was recently released by Unlearning Economics. What a coincidence, while I was finalizing the script of this video, they released an entire video dedicated to worker democracy. Unlearning Economics, being the person that they are, they cited quite a lot of studies, which definitely made things a hell of a lot easier for me to know which studies to look into. They also cited Uruguay and Italy as good examples of countries where the government is very supportive of worker co-ops, although in all likelihood I would probably look into how things are in Indonesia first. Okay, phew, finally. I'm sorry that this video turned out to be very long. I know I said I wanted to keep this under 30 minutes, but I figured it would be good to have something like this to lay out the groundwork for us to work from. As you can imagine, we've barely scratched the surface, which I intend to delve further in future segments, crossing my fingers that it would not be as long and time-consuming as this one. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, leave a comment down below, and ring the notification bell icon so that every time I upload a video, it goes right into your feed. Links to my socials in the end card and in the description down below. That's it. That is all from me for now. See you guys in the next one. Bye bye.